I bought a skyscraper with my name etched in 30-foot letters of steel and glass. The price? My next 10 birthdays. I purchased a fleet of private jets so I would never have to wait in line again. The cost? The simple ability to walk up a flight of stairs without my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I forged a $100 million empire from the dirt, fueled by black coffee and a sheer, bloody-minded will, and all it cost me in the end was everything. People ask me now what the fuel for my empire was. They expect to hear some arcane secret, a brilliant patent I filed, a lucky stock pick that paid off 1,000-fold, or a complex algorithm for success. But the truth is much simpler and infinitely more corrosive. The fuel was the unwavering, granite-hard belief that I was indestructible. That is the beginning and the end of it. I wasn't just a man building a business. I had convinced myself I was a force of nature. And forces of nature don't get sick. They don't require sleep. They don't recognize limits. They simply are. Now, my mornings unfold in this workshop. The sharp, clean scent of cedar and sawdust has replaced the sterile, recycled air of the boardroom. And as I run my hand over the smooth, patient grain of a piece of sanded pine, I find myself with more time than I know what to do with. Time to reflect on the man who ran on dust and diesel. That man feels like a stranger to me now, a ghost from a different lifetime. It all began on the docks, a world away from any executive suite. My education didn't come from a prestigious university. It was absorbed through the soles of my steel-toed boots. It was in the salty, damp air mixed with acrid diesel fumes, the thunderous groan of container ships being moored, the relentless cacophony of cranes and shouting men. I wasn't a manager in a crisp shirt. I was a grunt in a stained jumpsuit. My early 20s were a blur of loading and unloading trucks, of seeing the vast, intricate circulatory system of commerce from the inside at the capillary level. And what I witnessed was pure, unadulterated chaos masquerading as a functional system. I saw trucks idling for hours, burning fuel and time, waiting for paperwork that was lost on someone's desk. I saw pallets of perishable goods wilting under the sun because of a scheduling error. I'll never forget the face of a man, a small business owner, his face pale with panic, because a critical shipment of machine parts was sitting just 5 miles away in a warehouse, inaccessible, tangled in a web of corporate red tape. He was on the verge of losing his biggest client. I saw this, and it didn't just annoy me, it lit a fire in my gut. It was a symphony of systemic incompetence, and I couldn't stand the sound of it. The idea that became road transit wasn't born in a sudden flash of profound genius. It was forged slowly, over years of accumulated frustration. It wasn't about inventing a new piece of technology. It was about connecting the dots that everyone else was stepping over. They gave it a fancy name later, last mile logistics. For me, it was just glaringly obvious common sense. The colossal freight corporations were magnificent at hauling goods across continents, but they were utterly inept at the final, crucial 10 miles of the journey. That was the bottleneck. That was where efficiency went to die. That was where promises were broken and customers were lost. And that's where I saw my battlefield. I started with a van, a single dilapidated 1982 Ford Econoline I bought for $700 I had to borrow from my brother-in-law. I christened her the Prospector, because that's precisely what we were doing, prospecting for a future in a landscape others had written off. She was a magnificent beast of burden, more rust than paint, and her engine had a chronic cough that sounded terminal. But she ran. My days became a grueling, monotonous loop. I'd wake at 3 in the morning, the cold vinyl of her driver's seat a brutal shock to the system. I'd navigate the sleeping city using a crumpled paper map, highlighted routes glowing faintly under the cheap dome light. I delivered for the forgotten ones, the small bakeries needing flour before sunrise, the independent machine shops that required a single vital part, the local florists whose entire business depended on freshness. The big guys couldn't be bothered. Their indifference was my opportunity. My nights were spent in a different kind of intimacy with the Prospector. I'd be on my back on the cold concrete of my garage, a single bare bulb dangling overhead, a greasy rag in one hand and a dog-eared repair manual in the other. My hands were permanently stained with her motor oil, my knuckles raw and split. It felt, in a very real way, like I was transfusing my own life force into her aging steel frame, just to keep her heart beating for one more day, one more delivery. The fragrance of my early empire wasn't the refined scent of leather and mahogany. It was the raw perfume of progress, the aroma of stale coffee from a battered thermos, the sharp tang of gasoline on my clothes, and the metallic taste of pure adrenaline in the back of my throat. My wife, the incredible Clara, was my entire corporate infrastructure. Our small dining room table, scarred with coffee rings and ink stains, was our global headquarters. It served as the dispatch center, the accounting department, and the executive suite. I can still picture her, a phone with a long coiled cord tucked between her ear and shoulder, her voice a masterful blend of warmth and steel as she charmed a new client, all while her free hand was furiously scribbling numbers in a ledger. She was the architect of our solvency. I was just the hammer knocking down the walls. She never once complained. Not when I cashed out the tiny 401k from my dockyard job, not when I drained our meager savings account, and not even when I sat her down at that same table and told her I needed to take out a second mortgage on our small house to secure a business loan. I remember the silence that followed. It stretched for an eternity. Then she just nodded, a single, determined motion. "Okay, Gideon," she said. "Let's do it." She believed in me. Or perhaps she just understood that trying to stop me would be like trying to talk a river out of flowing to the sea. The sacrifices weren't even a conscious choice. They were simply the price of admission. I missed my daughter's 5th birthday party because a client had an emergency shipment. I listened to the sound of them singing "Happy Birthday" over the phone from a truck stop 200 miles away, the guilt a cold knot in my stomach. I told myself I was doing it for them. Hey, it's the great lie of the driven man. Sacrificing the present for a future your family might not even want, but temporary has a way of becoming a permanent state of being when you're chasing a horizon that keeps moving. The moment everything shifted, the pivot upon which my entire future turned came about a year in. I was running on fumes, physically and financially. I was on the verge of total collapse, haunted by the specter of failure. Then, I got a meeting with a regional grocery chain. I put on my only suit, which felt like a costume, and walked into a boardroom that was bigger than my entire house. I felt like an imposter. But when I spoke, I wasn't selling a service. I was preaching a gospel of efficiency I had learned in the trenches. They listened, and they signed. That contract wasn't for a life-changing amount of money, but it was real. It was tangible validation. The feeling of that signed paper in my hand was not just relief. It was a jolt of pure, uncut power that shot through my veins. It was the universe affirming that my obsession wasn't madness. The first thing I did with the advance wasn't to pay myself a salary or take Clara on that long-promised vacation. I bought a second van, a newer one, and then a third. That spark, that relentless, all-consuming hunger to build something from nothing. Does it burn inside you too? If you know that feeling, subscribe to the channel right now and do me a favor. Tell me in the comments what city or country you're building your own empire from. I want to know how far that fire reaches. Within 5 years, that solitary, sputtering van had multiplied into a legitimate fleet. I'll never forget the day I stood on a small hill overlooking our first real depot. It was just a rented plot of gravel with a cheap prefab office, but to me it was the Palace of Versailles. I watched as a dozen vans and 3 large trucks, all painted a crisp, immaculate white with the Road Transit logo I'd sketched on a napkin years before, moved in a perfectly coordinated ballet of commerce. Drivers in new uniforms, dispatchers crackling over radios, the constant, powerful hum of engines. My engines. I had willed this entire operation into existence through nothing but stubborn force. I had built it with my own 2 hands, fueled by an inexhaustible well of grit. Standing there, watching the afternoon sun glint off the windshields of my fleet, I didn't feel like a businessman. I felt like a creator, a minor god of my own small universe. I was the engine behind it all, and I was convinced, with every fiber of my being, that each one of those vehicles was an extension of my own heart. And my heart, I believed, was a machine that would never ever stop beating. The transition from the driver's seat of the Prospector to the executive chair on the 50th floor was not a gradual climb. It was a violent, disorienting ascent. One day, my world was the gritty reality of asphalt and loading docks. The next, it was a silent, climate-controlled kingdom of glass and steel suspended halfway to the heavens. My office was less a workspace and more a testament to my own perceived divinity. 3 of its walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, and from that perch, the city below ceased to be a place of people and struggle. It became an abstract, a living map, a collection of assets and territories. The trucks of my competitors were tiny insects, scurrying through the canyons I now surveyed. The roar of commerce that had once been my entire world was reduced to a distant, respectful hum. I had risen above the noise. The man who wore grease-stained overalls was buried under layers of hand-stitched Italian wool. The calloused hands that had once wrestled with stubborn engines were now manicured, their primary function reduced to signing checks with 7, 8, 9 figures. The name Gideon Rowe was no longer just a name, it was a brand, a synonym for relentless expansion and ruthless efficiency. When I walked into a room, conversations would dip, and powerful men would rise to their feet. I didn't command this respect. I inhaled it. It was the oxygen of my new reality, and I found it intoxicatingly addictive. I had stopped being a man who ran a company. I had become the company itself. My identity and the corporate identity of Rowe Transit had fused. Its growth was my growth. Its ambition was my ambition, and its refusal to stop, to even pause for breath, had become my personal creed. This is where the first crack appeared. It wasn't in a financial statement or a market forecast. It was inside my own skull. I was in a tense negotiation to acquire a smaller rival firm. The air in the boardroom was thick with unspoken hostility. I was on the offensive, dismantling their lead counsel's argument piece by piece, enjoying the surgical precision of it. And then, for a split second, the world tilted. The sharp lines of the mahogany table blurred, and a wave of vertigo washed over me so intensely that I had to grip the arms of my leather chair to keep from swaying. The voice of the opposing CEO became a distant, meaningless drone. A cold sweat prickled my hairline. It lasted no more than 3 seconds, but in that brief eternity, I was utterly terrified. Then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. I blinked. The room snapped back into focus, and I fired back a response without missing a beat. No one noticed. To them, I was a predator, closing in. To me, for that fleeting moment, I was fragile prey. Later that night, I dismissed it. Stress, I told myself, pouring a generous measure of scotch. The price of victory. It was the first of many lies I would tell myself. The human mind has a terrifying capacity for self-deception, especially when the truth is inconvenient. My body was sending its first hesitant signal, a single flickering warning light on the dashboard. I chose consciously to ignore it. The symptoms began to arrive like uninvited guests. A few months later, it was a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest as I was reviewing quarterly reports. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. I stood up, walked to my window, and watched the relentless flow of traffic below. Indigestion, I rationalized. Too much coffee, too many rich dinners. I started keeping antacids in my desk drawer, a small concession to a problem I refused to properly name. The headaches came next. Dull, persistent throbs that started behind my eyes and radiated outwards, a constant low-grade pressure that even the strongest painkillers couldn't completely erase. Clara, my anchor to the real world, saw it all. She saw the subtle tells I thought I was hiding so masterfully. She saw the exhaustion behind my eyes that no amount of success could mask. She saw me rubbing my temples when I thought no one was looking. She saw my hand tremble slightly as I reached for my 3rd cup of coffee before 8 in the morning. "Gideon, you need a break," she'd say, her voice gentle but firm. We were in our new house, a sprawling architectural marvel that felt more like a museum than a home. "We have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. Let's go away, just the 2 of us, to that little coastal town in Italy you always talked about." I'd look at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "A break? Clara now? We're about to go public. This is the most critical juncture in the company's history. Taking a vacation now would be like a general leaving the field in the middle of a battle." "It's always the most critical juncture," she replied, her gaze unwavering. You said that 5 years ago. You'll say it again 5 years from now. The mountain keeps getting higher because you keep building it. When will you finally stop and just enjoy the view? Her concern, which came from a place of deep love, began to feel like an accusation. To my warped mind, her plea for me to rest sounded like a suggestion for me to be weak, to fail. I had so thoroughly conflated perpetual motion with success that I viewed stillness as a form of death. I had built this empire on the myth of the indefatigable Gideon Rowe, the man who outworked, outthought, and outlasted everyone. How could I now admit that the man was made of the same fallible flesh as everyone else? So I did what I did best. I deflected. I minimized. I promised. After the IPO, Clara, I promise, we'll go anywhere you want. It was another lie. We both knew it. The arrogance wasn't just about my business acumen anymore. It had metastasized. It had become a profound biological arrogance. I viewed my own body as a subordinate, an employee that had no right to complain. It was a tool, a piece of high-performance machinery that existed for one purpose, to serve the ambitions of my mind. And when it started to sputter, my response wasn't concern. It was annoyance. I was a CEO dealing with a whiny, underperforming asset. So I pushed it harder. Longer hours, more caffeine, more flights across more time zones. I prided myself on never having taken a sick day in my life. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of my superior will. In reality, it was a sign of my profound stupidity. The breaking point, the moment Clara put her foot down, came after a charity gala. I had delivered a keynote speech and was surrounded by a swarm of admirers. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, but this time it was accompanied by a shortness of breath. I felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. I managed to excuse myself, making my way to a quiet balcony, where I leaned heavily against the railing, gasping for air under the cold night sky. Clara found me there. The look on her face was not one of pity, but of cold, clear-eyed fear. The next morning, she didn't ask. She informed. "You have an appointment with Dr. Evans at 2 o'clock. I've already cleared your schedule. You're going." I went, mostly to placate her. I sat in the sterile examination room, the paper crinkling beneath me, feeling utterly out of place. Dr. Evans was a man in his 60s with a calm, serious demeanor that I found immediately irritating. After a battery of tests, he sat me down in his office. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the charts, the numbers, the stark black and white evidence of my self-neglect. "Gideon," he began, his tone leaving no room for argument, "let me be perfectly clear. Your blood pressure is at a level that I would consider a medical emergency. Your cholesterol is astronomical. The EKG shows significant cardiac stress. To put this in terms you might appreciate, your body is an engine that has been redlining for a decade without a single oil change. This isn't a suggestion to slow down. This is an ultimatum from your own biology. You either make radical, immediate changes to your lifestyle, or your body is going to make the decision for you. And it won't be a gentle one." I listened to his words, but they didn't penetrate. They were just data points, inconvenient variables in my grand equation. I saw his concern not as a professional diagnosis, but as the weak-willed whining of a man who didn't understand what it took to build something truly great. He gave me a folder thick with prescriptions, dietary plans and referrals, a roadmap to survival. I remember the feeling of that folder in my hands. It felt heavy, like an anchor. I stood up, gave him a curt, dismissive nod, and walked out of his office. I didn't go home. I went straight back to my skyscraper. My executive assistant met me at the elevator, her face a mask of anxiety. "Mr. Rowe, the board is waiting. The final papers for the Sterling acquisition are ready." I walked into that boardroom, the doctor's dire warnings echoing faintly in my mind like a distant siren. I saw the contract on the table, the culmination of 6 months of brutal, relentless work. It was the biggest acquisition in our history, a legacy-defining deal. I picked up the pen. In my mind, by signing this document, I was proving him wrong. I was proving that I was stronger than his charts and his numbers. I was demonstrating the power of will over matter. In reality, as I scrawled my name on that line, I had just reached over to the dashboard of my life and ripped out the check engine light with my bare hands. I had just cut the wire to my own emergency brake. The Sterling acquisition was not the clean, decisive victory I had envisioned. It was more like a hostile organ transplant. My company, Row Transit, was the recipient, and the newly acquired entity was a foreign body that my corporate system was trying violently to reject. I had imagined a seamless integration, a triumphant fusion of two powers into one unstoppable force. The reality was a grinding, brutal war fought not on a battlefield, but in spreadsheets, boardrooms, and endless conference calls. Their corporate culture was a stagnant pool of complacency. Mine was a raging river of perpetual ambition. Mixing the two created a toxic sludge of resentment, inefficiency, and outright sabotage. My days, which had already been punishing, became exercises in sustained crisis management. I was no longer a CEO. I was a firefighter, a battlefield surgeon, and a warden all at once. I'd spend my mornings placating their terrified, hostile senior management, my afternoons untangling 2 decades of their archaic logistical nightmares, and my nights trying to convince my own board that the billion-dollar gamble was going to pay off. The pressure was no longer just a feature of the job. It was the very air I breathed, a thick, suffocating atmosphere from which there was no escape. And my body, that disobedient subordinate, began to protest with increasing vehemence. The occasional dizzy spell became a regular occurrence, a sudden lurching of the world that would force me to grip a table or a wall to remain upright. The dull headaches blossomed into full-blown migraines that felt like a hot spike being driven through my eye socket. The most unnerving new symptom, however, was the heart palpitations. They would come without warning, a sudden, frantic, irregular drumbeat in my chest, a chaotic fluttering that felt like my heart was trying to break out of its cage. It was the terrifying, visceral sensation of my own body rebelling against my command. In response, I did not retreat. I doubled down. I became a master of concealment, a high-stakes actor playing the role of the invulnerable titan, Gideon Rowe. The performance was my new full-time job. I learned to disguise a moment of vertigo as a thoughtful pause, bowing my head as if in deep concentration. I'd blame a trembling hand on having had one too many espressos, making a self-deprecating joke to deflect suspicion. The palpitations were the hardest to hide. During one particularly intense board meeting, I felt that frantic rhythm begin. The panic rose in my throat, cold and metallic. I calmly excused myself, walked to the private restroom adjoining my office, and splashed freezing water on my face until the chaotic drumming subsided into a merely dangerously fast but regular beat. I walked back into the boardroom 5 minutes later, offered a cool apology for the interruption, and closed the deal. No one suspected a thing. My deception was my shield, and my ego was its forge. This life of subterfuge inevitably bled into my home life, poisoning the one sanctuary I had left. Clara was no fool. She had a sixth sense for my well-being, honed over 30 years of partnership. She saw the new prescriptions in the medicine cabinet, beta blockers and high-potency painkillers I hadn't told her about. "What are these, Gideon?" she asked one evening, holding a small orange bottle as if it were a live grenade. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual warmth. "They're nothing," I lied, not even looking up from my laptop. "Dr. Evans gave them to me for tension headaches. The label says they're for arrhythmia and severe hypertension," she said, her voice cutting through my defenses. I looked it up. "Your heart is in trouble, isn't it?" I finally closed the laptop and looked at her. I saw the deep fear in her eyes, and it made me angry. I was furious that she had exposed me, that she had forced me to confront a truth I was investing every ounce of my energy into denying. "It's under control," I said, my voice cold and hard. "It's a side effect of the pressure. It will pass once the merger is finalized." "And what if it doesn't?" she pressed, stepping closer. "What if the merger finalizes you first? You are not just the CEO of Row Transit, Gideon. You are my husband. You are a father. Don't those roles mean anything anymore?" "Everything I am doing is for this family," I shot back, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "No," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Everything you are doing is for the name on the side of your trucks. We are just spectators now, watching you slowly kill yourself for it." She left the bottle on the table and walked out of the room. The silence she left behind was louder than any argument. That night, for the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine fear that I was losing something far more valuable than a business deal. But by morning, the fear had been buried again under a fresh layer of ambition and denial. To free up my time for the strategic warfare of the integration, I began to delegate more of the day-to-day operations to my vice president, a bright, fiercely loyal young man named David. He had been with me for a decade, rising through the ranks. He worshipped me, emulating my work ethic, my speech patterns, my relentless drive. I saw it as effective mentorship. In retrospect, I see it for what it was. I was creating a younger, healthier version of myself to burn as fuel. I offloaded the operational headaches, the personnel issues, the logistical minutiae onto his shoulders so that I could remain on the 50,000-foot-high battlefield. He took on the burden without complaint, working the same 18-hour days I once had, his eyes showing the same mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. I was proud of him. I was also unwittingly teaching him my own suicidal playbook. The climax of this period of self-delusion, the moment that should have been my final unequivocal wake-up call, arrived during the official press conference announcing the successful completion of the Sterling acquisition. It was a grand affair held in a hotel ballroom, packed with journalists, analysts, and industry figures. The lights were blindingly bright, the air thick with anticipation. This was my coronation, the public validation of my genius and my will. I stood at the podium, a confident smile fixed on my face, the logos of Rowe Transit and Sterling projected onto a massive screen behind me. I began my speech, my voice booming with a confidence I absolutely did not feel. Halfway through my prepared remarks, it happened. It started not as a flutter, but as a violent, jarring kick in my chest, as if my heart had been struck by a fist. Then came the chaotic, impossibly fast rhythm, far worse than anything I had experienced before. My vision began to narrow, the edges of the room turning grey and fuzzy, like an old photograph burning from the outside in. The faces in the crowd dissolved into indistinct blurs. The sound of my own voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. A cold sweat drenched my shirt in seconds. I gripped the sides of the lectern, my knuckles turning white, convinced I was about to collapse right there, in front of the entire financial world. "This is it," a small, terrified voice in the back of my mind screamed. "This is how it ends." But then, another voice, the one that had been in command for 30 years, roared back. It was the voice of the Empire, the voice of Gideon Rowe, the myth. "You do not fall, you do not falter, finish it." I don't know how I did it. I locked my knees to keep from buckling. I focused on the single red light of a television camera at the back of the room, using it as an anchor in a spinning world. I continued speaking, the words coming out on autopilot, my mind a maelstrom of sheer terror and pure, defiant will. I felt the world start to darken completely. A voice inside me, the last vestige of self-preservation, shrieked, "Stop!" But the voice of my ambition, the voice that had built everything, shouted it down. I finished the speech. I even managed a final, triumphant smile for the cameras. As I said my final thank you, the room erupted in thunderous applause. The sound washed over me, a wave of validation and victory. To them, it was the sound of success. To me, it was the sound of a firing squad's volley that had somehow missed its mark. I had faced down my own mortality and won. In that moment, I did not feel mortal or fragile. I felt immortal. I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. The applause continued, loud and insistent. It was the most expensive applause of my life. Surviving the press conference did not fill me with a sense of relief or gratitude. It filled me with a terrifying, intoxicating sense of invincibility. I had walked through the fire and emerged unsinged. I had faced down the rebellion in my own chest and had, through sheer force of will, commanded it back into submission. In my mind, it was not a near miss, it was a conquest. I had met my own mortality in a direct confrontation and had proven myself the stronger party. This dangerous conclusion became the new cornerstone of my philosophy. The laws of biology, I reasoned, were like the laws of the market. They applied to lesser men, to the timid and the weak. I, Gideon Rowe, was an exception. I was operating under a different set of rules, a charter I had written for myself. This newfound hubris was essential because the empire was teetering on a knife's edge. The merger, so triumphant on paper, was a quagmire in practice. The promised synergies were a corporate fiction. In reality, I had instigated a brutal civil war within my own organization. The legacy road transit employees, imbued with my aggressive, take-no-prisoners ethos, clashed violently with the entrenched, change-averse bureaucracy of the Sterling Corporation. Productivity plummeted. Key personnel resigned in disgust. The logistical networks we were trying to merge were snarled into a Gordian knot of incompatible systems and open animosity. We were hemorrhaging money. The colossal debt I had taken on to finance the acquisition, now a millstone around the company's neck. I was the sole pillar holding up a crumbling cathedral. The investors, who had once lauded me as a visionary, were now a chorus of nervous, impatient whispers on daily conference calls. The board, my board, was growing restless, their faith eroding with every negative quarterly projection. They had bet on the myth of Gideon Rowe, and the myth was showing signs of strain. I knew I was in a race, a desperate high-stakes sprint against the clock, not just against the fiscal quarter, but against my own body's internal unforgiving clock. I had to stabilize the ship, to force the integration through, to show a definitive turn towards profitability before the whispers became a roar, and before my own internal traitor could stage a final successful coup. Life became a meticulously managed performance of vitality. My existence was a carefully curated cocktail of pharmaceuticals, beta blockers, to keep the frantic rhythm of my heart from breaking through my ribs, potent analgesics to dull the relentless cranial pressure, and imported stimulants to carve a few more hours of functional consciousness out of each day. I ate because one must, but food had lost its taste, turning to ash in my mouth. Sleep was a rare and precious commodity. A frantic, shallow dip into oblivion for 2 or 3 hours before I'd jolt awake, my heart hammering, my mind already churning through the day's impending crises. I'd sit on the edge of our cavernous bed in the pre-dawn stillness, the cool air raising goosebumps on my skin, and I would coach myself back from the brink, breathing slowly, methodically, willing the machine back under my control. Clara had retreated into a state of quiet, sorrowful observation. The argument ceased. In their place was a vast, silent gulf between us. She would watch me from across the dinner table, her eyes filled with a sadness so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. It was the look one gives to something already lost. Her silence was a far more damning indictment than her words had ever been. She was no longer fighting for me. She was waiting for the inevitable crash. I, in my self-imposed isolation, interpreted her resignation as a lack of faith, another obstacle to overcome, another person to prove wrong. Her sorrow became fuel for my defiant fire. My primary human contact became the disembodied faces on the myriad screens that now defined my world. The most critical of these was a weekly video conference with a consortium of our new European investors, skeptical, cold-eyed bankers who had financed a significant portion of the deal. Calming their nerves was my most important task. During one of these calls, as I was delivering a confident, data-rich presentation on our progress, I felt a strange, tingling sensation begin in the fingertips of my left hand. It was a pins and needles feeling, but deeper, more electric. Within seconds, it began to creep up my arm, a slow, terrifying numbness that felt like my own limb was ceasing to belong to me. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. My first instinct was to grab my arm, to show weakness, but the face of the lead banker, a man named Dubois, was on the main screen, his expression a mask of unblinking scrutiny. I could not falter. With a supreme act of will, I let my left hand drop into my lap, out of the camera's view, while my right hand continued to gesture calmly at the charts on the screen behind me. My voice, to my own astonishment, remained perfectly even, my tone assured and steady. As you can see from the Q3 projections, the initial capital bleed is stabilizing, and we anticipate a positive synergy dividend by the end of the fiscal year. The words felt alien, disconnected from the primal scream that was echoing inside my own skull. I was a ventriloquist, my body a dummy, and the performance was all that mattered. I spent the next 15 minutes of that call dissecting market trends and outlining future strategies, all while a significant portion of my body was staging a silent, terrifying mutiny under the polished surface of the boardroom table. When the call ended, I sat frozen in my chair for a full minute, drenched in a cold sweat, waiting for the feeling in my arm to return. That incident marked a new phase. I was no longer just ignoring the warnings. I was actively at war with them. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to the company, to the monumental task of securing my legacy. Every beat of my heart felt like a gift, a borrowed moment I had to use to its fullest. There was no room for rest, no quarter given. The culmination of this insane campaign was a single document. I had spent weeks with the legal and operational teams drafting it. We called it the Unification Directive. It was a sweeping, autocratic set of protocols that would dissolve the last vestiges of the old Sterling infrastructure and forcibly meld them into the Row Transit model. It was brutal, uncompromising, and absolutely necessary. It would centralize all power, streamline all operations, and give me the direct, unmediated control I needed to cauterize the company's financial wounds. It was my final, all-or-nothing gamble. Its implementation would either save the empire or shatter it completely. The night I was to sign it, the office was deserted. A deep, cathedral-like silence had fallen over the 50th floor. I stood at my window for a long time, looking down at the city. The streets were rivers of light, a vast, intricate network of arteries, and I felt a paternalistic sense of ownership over all of it. I had helped build this. My trucks, my vans, my people, they were down there, the lifeblood of this urban giant. This was my kingdom. The directive was the final fortification of its walls. I walked back to my desk. The document lay there, 20 pages of dense legal text, bound in a simple blue folder. It felt heavier than its physical weight. It was the distillation of my entire life's work, my ambition given legal form. I sat down, the leather of my chair sighing softly. I uncapped my fountain pen, a heavy, expensive instrument that had signed deals worth billions. As I poised the nib over the signature line, the pain arrived. It was the familiar ache in my chest, but it wasn't a warning this time. It was a clear, sharp, undeniable command. A searing pain that radiated from the center of my chest, down my numb left arm, and up into my jaw. My breath hitched. The pen froze an inch above the paper. The voice of Dr. Evans, the voice of Clara, the faint, desperate voice of my own exhausted body. They all screamed at me in that one silent moment. Stop. Put down the pen. Call for help. Live. I looked at the signature line. Gideon Rowe, CEO and Chairman. My legacy. My name. The pain intensified, a crushing weight, and I had a moment of absolute clarity. I could choose the pain, the uncertainty, the humiliation of admitting defeat, or I could choose immortality. I could sign my name and cement my victory forever. I said a small, quiet prayer to the God I had become. Just let me finish this, I whispered to the empty room. Just one more signature, then you can rest. I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed, black and final. My name appeared on the line, a perfect, defiant script. A surge of pure, triumphant euphoria washed over me, momentarily eclipsing the pain. It was done. My greatest professional triumph was complete. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment of blinding hubris, was that my body, with its own cold and final authority, was simultaneously signing my abdication. My last act as king was to sign away the kingdom. This is the turning point. The moment the bill for 30 years of borrowed time came due, with interest compounded hourly. Before I tell you how the castle of cards finally collapsed, I need you to do something. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, and then I want you to go to the comments and tell me what you think my fatal error was. Was it ignoring the doctors, or was it ignoring myself? I truly want to know what you see. The euphoria of signing the Unification Directive was a brilliant, blinding flash. It was the feeling of a general watching the final decisive cavalry charge that he knows will win the war. I leaned back in my chair, the pen still in my hand, and for a fleeting moment, the crushing pain in my chest seemed to recede. intimidated by the sheer magnitude of my triumph. I felt a profound sense of completion, of destiny fulfilled. I had wrestled my legacy from the jaws of chaos and had chained it to my name. I was no longer just a man. I was a historical fact. The journey home that night was surreal. I didn't take my usual chauffeured car. I wanted to drive myself. I wanted to feel the engine of my German sedan respond to my touch, to be in control of a machine that did exactly what I told it to. The city lights smeared across my windshield like wet paint, a vibrant, beautiful blur. The pain was still there, a low, ominous hum beneath the surface of my elation, but I chose to interpret it not as a threat, but as the aftershock of a great exertion. It was the price of greatness, the honorable ache of a battle won. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of my home. The house was ablaze with light, a modern fortress of glass and stone that looked more like a corporate retreat than a family residence. As I parked the car in the cavernous garage, I felt a wave of profound weariness wash over me, so heavy it was almost a physical blow. The adrenaline from the signing was finally draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. Now you can rest, I told myself. The war is over. I walked into the house through the kitchen. Clara was there, sitting at the large granite island, a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading. She looked up as I entered. Her face was pale, etched with a familiar worry. "You're late," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Had to finalize some things," I replied, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I loosened my tie, the silk feeling like a noose. "It's done, Clara. It's all done." I expected a reaction, relief perhaps, or even a grudging congratulations. Instead, she just looked at me, her gaze traveling from my face down to my left arm, which I was unconsciously rubbing. "Gideon," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you don't look well." And that's when it happened. It wasn't a gradual escalation. It was a sudden, violent, full-system failure. The pain in my chest didn't just intensify, it exploded. It was a brutal, crushing weight, an invisible anvil dropped squarely on my sternum. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a deep, compressive force that stole every molecule of air from my lungs. The world didn't tilt or blur. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring, white-hot universe of pure, agonizing pressure. My legs gave way. I remember the sensation of falling, the sound of my shoulder striking a cabinet with a sickening thud, and the cold, unyielding shock of the marble floor against my cheek. I tried to speak, to call out Clara's name, but all that came out was a strangled, guttural gasp. My vision was a pinprick of light in a vast, encroaching darkness. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was Clara's face, her mouth open in a silent scream, a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The engine had not just seized, it had thrown a rod, cracked the block, and burst into flames. The next moments, or days, or eons, were a chaotic fever dream of disconnected sensations. The shrill, piercing scream of a siren, a voice shouting medical jargon above me, the feeling of being lifted, the rhythmic, percussive thump of CPR, a sharp, electric jolt that arched my back off a gurney. It was a collage of terror, a slideshow of my own dissolution, experienced from a strange, detached perspective. I was a passenger in a body that was no longer mine to command. I awoke to the color beige, the beige of ceiling tiles, the beige of bland curtains, the beige of a thin hospital blanket. The first coherent thought that filtered through the fog of medication was the sound, the soft, rhythmic, metronomic beeping of a machine somewhere to my right. It was a sound that meant one thing: you are alive, but only just. I tried to turn my head, but the effort was Herculean. My body felt like it was filled with wet sand. I felt tubes, in my nose, in my arm, a scratchy presence in my throat. I was tethered, a broken machine plugged into a wall of life-sustaining technology. And then I saw her. Clara was asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle. She looked 10 years older than she had the night before. Her face was a landscape of exhaustion and fear, her hair disheveled, her clothes rumpled. She had not left. Seeing her there, a lone, weary sentinel, was the first thing that broke through my wall of ego. A wave of shame so profound it was physically painful washed over me. I had done this to her. She must have sensed my consciousness returning because her eyes fluttered open. They focused on me, and for a moment there was just pure, unvarnished relief. Then she was at my side, her hand gently taking mine. Her touch was the first real thing I had felt since the fall. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You're back." I couldn't speak because of the tube in my throat, but I tried to squeeze her hand. The doctors came in then, a flotilla of serious faces in white coats. They spoke in low, calm tones, but the words they used were brutal, unforgiving. Massive myocardial infarction. Significant heart muscle damage. Lucky to have survived the initial event. They were describing the wreckage of a car crash, but the car was me. It was Clara who had to deliver the news about the Empire. She did it a few days later, after I had been moved from the ICU to a private room and the breathing tube had been removed. She delivered the information with a gentle surgical precision, knowing each word was a potential blow to a heart that could not withstand any more shocks. My sudden, catastrophic incapacitation had created a power vacuum of epic proportions. The news of my heart attack had leaked to the press within hours, and the market, that great fickle beast that runs on confidence, had reacted with predictable panic. Roe Transit stock plummeted in pre-market trading. The European investors, whose confidence I had so carefully cultivated, had invoked a key man clause in their financing agreement, a clause I had dismissed as a mere formality. It gave them the right to call in their entire loan immediately, if I was rendered unable to perform my duties. It was a financial doomsday weapon, and they had just armed it. The board had convened an emergency session. David, my loyal protégé, had tried to hold the line, tried to reassure everyone that the unification directive was in place and that the plan was sound. But the plan was inextricably linked to me. I was the plan. Without its architect, the grand design was just a set of incomprehensible blueprints. Faced with a complete collapse of shareholder value and the looming threat of the investors calling in their debt, which would trigger immediate bankruptcy, the board had made the only decision they could. They sold the company. The words hung in the air of that quiet, sterile room. They sold it. To our largest competitor, a soulless, globe-spanning conglomerate I had spent my entire career fighting against. They had swooped in like vultures, acquiring my life's work in a fire sale for a fraction of its true value. They weren't buying a company, they were buying a carcass. My name, Gideon Roe, the name that had been etched into the sky, was now just a footnote in a press release announcing a hostile takeover. I lay there listening to Clara's gentle voice detail the swift, merciless dismantling of everything I had built. The unification directive was scrapped. David was fired. My name was being physically removed from the company headquarters. The Empire was gone. Not diminished, not struggling. Gone, erased. And all I could do was lie in that beige room, tethered to a beeping machine, and watch the ghost of my legacy flicker and die in the reflection of a blank television screen. I hadn't just lost my company, I had lost my identity. The myth of Gideon Roe had finally, catastrophically, collided with the reality of the man. And there was nothing left but the wreckage. The journey back from the precipice is not a heroic climb. It's a slow, humiliating crawl. The man who left that hospital was not Gideon Roe, the titan of industry. He was a fragile, diminished creature, a hollowed-out version of the man who had entered it. My body was a foreign country in which I was a reluctant and clumsy tourist. I had to relearn its geography, its new, punishing limitations. A simple walk from the bedroom to the kitchen was a monumental expedition that left me breathless. I, who had once flown across continents without a second thought, now measured my world in the number of steps between chairs. The first few months after my return were a landscape of profound emptiness. The silence was the most deafening part. For 30 years, my life had been a relentless symphony of ringing phones, urgent emails, and back-to-back meetings. Now the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, each tick a mocking reminder of the vast, unstructured emptiness of my days. My friends, the sycophants, the business associates, the powerful figures who had once clamored for my attention, had vanished as if they had never existed. My phone, once the conduit of my power, now sat inert, a dark, silent monument to my own irrelevance. The world I had built, the world that had revolved around me, had simply moved on without me. I was adrift in a sea of shame and bitterness. I would sit for hours in our cavernous, minimalist living room, a space designed for entertaining hundreds, not for comforting one broken man, and I would rage. I would replay every decision, every ignored warning, every moment of hubris. I cursed the board for their cowardice, the investors for their ruthlessness, and my own body for its ultimate betrayal. I was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, and the bitterness was a poison that corroded me from the inside out. I had lost my fortune, but what felt far worse was that I had lost my purpose. My entire identity had been wrapped up in the colossal edifice of Row Transit. Without it, who was I? I had no idea. It was Clara who saved me. Not with grand speeches or pep talks, but with a quiet, relentless patience. She endured my black moods and my childish tantrums. She would sit with me in the crushing silence, not trying to fill it, but simply sharing it. She became my physical therapist, my nurse, and my confessor. One morning she came into the living room where I was stewing in my usual toxic brew of self-pity. She didn't say a word. She just placed a small, simple wooden toolbox on the coffee table in front of me. It was old, the wood weathered and smooth from use. It had been my father's. "Your father used to say that working with your hands keeps the devil out of your head," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to make something instead of just breaking things." I looked at that box for a long time. The idea was absurd. Me, the man who moved global supply chains, was supposed to find solace in a piece of wood and a handful of old tools. But the next day, out of sheer desperate boredom, I took the box out to the garage, the same garage where I had once spent my nights nursing the prospector back to life. I found a piece of scrap pine. I picked up a simple hand plane, and I began to work. The first pass of the blade across the wood was awkward, clumsy, but the sound, a soft, satisfying shh, and the scent of the fresh pine shavings, clean and honest, did something to me. It was the first real, tangible thing I had experienced in months. It wasn't an abstract number on a spreadsheet or a fluctuating stock price. It was wood. It was real. That garage became my sanctuary. The work was slow, painstaking. It demanded a focus that left no room for bitterness. My hands, once soft from years of disuse, grew calloused again. I wasn't building an empire. I was building a small wobbly bookshelf. But the sense of accomplishment when I finished it, when I ran my hand over the imperfect but solid final product, was more profound than any billion-dollar deal I had ever closed. I had created something with my own hands, something that existed purely for its own sake, not for profit or for glory. It was a revelation. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to build a new life, a smaller, quieter, infinitely richer life. We sold the architectural marvel of a house, that cold glass palace, and bought a modest home in a town I hadn't even known existed, a place with old trees and neighbors who knew each other's names. We used the proceeds from the sale to live. The vast fortune was gone, swallowed by legal fees and the corporate collapse, but we had enough. For the first time, I learned the profound difference between having a fortune and having enough. David, my former protégé, came to visit one Sunday. I was nervous to see him, ashamed of what my ambition had cost him. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were clear. He didn't come with recriminations. He came with a bottle of wine and a simple question. "Are you happy, Gideon?" I thought about it for a long time, standing there in my small workshop, the smell of sawdust in the air. "I'm at peace," I finally said, and I was stunned to realize it was the absolute truth. The relentless, gnawing hunger that had driven me my entire life was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness I had never known. This is the lesson, the final, hard-won entry in the ledger of my life. I spent 30 years accumulating a type of wealth that could be counted, audited, and displayed. I built a monument to my own ego, brick by painstaking brick, sacrificing my health, my family, and my own soul on its altar. I believed that my net worth was the ultimate measure of my worth as a man. I was a fool, a rich, powerful, celebrated fool. The true currency of life isn't the dollar or the euro or the yen, it's time. It's the non-renewable, irretrievable, breathtakingly precious resource of our own heartbeats. I traded my heartbeats for market share. I bartered my sunrises for quarterly reports. I sold my moments with my wife for a higher stock price. I lost $100 million empire, and in doing so, I stumbled upon a wealth that cannot be quantified. I won back my mornings. I won back the simple joy of a shared meal with Clara, where the conversation isn't about business, but about the birds in the garden. I won back the ability to read a book without my mind racing a dozen moves ahead. I learned that the most important balance sheet isn't the one you present to your shareholders. It's the one you present to yourself. And mine had been catastrophically in the red. I needed to lose everything to finally understand what true profit was. Now, I look at these hands. They are scarred and calloused, not from signing contracts, but from shaping wood. They don't build empires anymore. They build birdhouses for my grandchildren, and in this small, quiet life, I have found a richness that my former self, the titan in his glass tower, could never have possibly imagined. So this is my final advice to you, from a man who has been to the summit and has seen the emptiness of the view. Do not be afraid to be ambitious. Build your dreams, but know the price. Never, ever trade the priceless for the priced, because no amount of money in the world is worth the value of your next sunrise, your next conversation with someone you love, your next quiet, peaceful heartbeat. If my story has taught you anything, share this video with someone you care about who might need to ease up on the throttle. And for the last time, please, leave a comment below. I want you to answer this. What is the most valuable asset in your life that money can't buy? I'm going to read every single one of your answers. Take care of yourselves.